US President Donald Trump could be set for another round of talks with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, after Moscow reviewed a deal proposed by Washington for a ceasefire in Ukraine and stressed it has some reservations. The Kremlin says US envoy Stephen Witkoff met with the Russian leader and will deliver Mr. Putin's assessments of that proposal to Mr. Trump, adding there are reasons to be cautiously optimistic. Mr. Putin reportedly expressing solidarity with the US president's position on Ukraine. Russia earlier said it agreed in principle with the US proposal for a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine, but with conditions. Mr. Putin has stressed that the terms need to be worked out and more negotiations are still needed. And for more, we're joined by Nick Harper live from Washington, D.C. and Dasha Chernyshova from Moscow. Let's start with Dasha first. Dasha, the Kremlin, as we just said, cautiously optimistic, stressing that it agrees in principle, but it still has reservations. It has not ceded any ground as far as Ukraine is considered, has it?
Oh, that's right. The statements from the Kremlin do give hope that Russia is indeed cautiously optimistic, something that we also have heard from the American side. At this stage, we understand Moscow has received additional details from the U.S. envoy Stephen Witkoff, who held a meeting with the Russian president on Thursday evening in the Russian capital, and Moscow has sent its signals to the U.S. President Donald Trump. So at this stage, we understand the sides are in the negotiations process. They are exchanging the opinions, and this is normal practice according to the Kremlin officials. We're also hearing that Moscow and Washington both, according to Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, believe that a conversation will need to be held in the coming time. We also understand that there are concerns on the Russian side. They primarily are related to the idea of a ceasefire for 30 days as not part of the lasting solution. Moscow believes in this case Ukraine will have an opportunity to rearm and to remobilize.
All right, Dasha, we lost you for a moment there, but if I could just repeat, Russian concerns that a lasting solution that is not being addressed and a ceasefire might come before that and give Ukraine a chance to rearm. Nick, if we could bring you in here, given that this concern has not actually been addressed as far as we know, could anything come out of any conversation between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump?
Well, so it's a little bit unclear at this stage, but what both sides are expressing is some quiet optimism. They certainly want to move things forward, both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, suggesting that a phone call or a meeting is something that they would try and entertain. But we do know that obviously that meeting with Steve Witkoff might hold the key to all of this. He's on his way back to the United States with information from Vladimir Putin that he will be transmitting to Donald Trump. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, said that there is a signal within that and additional information that he must give to Donald Trump before President Putin is happy to speak to Donald Trump himself. So that information needs to be relayed at some point during the course of today to Donald Trump, and we'll see where things go from there. But I think part of the problem is that President Putin is speaking about trying to tackle the root causes of this conflict. And if you think back more than 3 years ago, when this invasion took place, at the time he was speaking about trying to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. He said those were the root causes of this conflict, and that was why he said Russia had to launch this special military operation. Now, tackling those type of things and creating a ceasefire at the same time seems particularly difficult. So it'll be hard to judge whether he decides to stick to his guns on those matters, but that seems to be something that he wants to be able to discuss with President Trump at some point.
All right, Dasha, difficulty is clearly there, and what might tip the balance is another partner, Europe. It's trying to ensure that its voice is heard in any kind of negotiations between the US and Russia on a peace deal effectively in Europe. That's, of course, in Ukraine. You know, the EU extending Russian sanctions on individuals and entities. Is this likely to affect any outcome of talks going on right now, not just between potential ones between the leaders, but as Nick Harper mentioned as well, Stephen Witkoff relaying concerns to President Trump?
Well, the understanding in Moscow is that it wants to negotiate with the United States, and Moscow has noticed the change in tone in Washington, and has over the course of the past weeks been stressing that it is Europe that is seeking the continuation of this conflict, while the US has changed its rhetoric and wants to find a negotiated settlement. So even if there are more sanctions on the part of the European countries, it does seem that they will not have significant effect on those negotiations. But having said that, you also have to keep in mind the idea of the European countries to supply more weapons to Ukraine, the idea to increase the military expenditures. And that is certainly something that Moscow will be strongly against, because Moscow suggests that more weapons to Ukraine do not encourage Kyiv to get to the negotiating table. But also, we understand that Moscow making gains on the battlefield is one of the reasons why Moscow is so certain in its negotiating position, stressing once again that any talks on Ukraine will be stemming from the current situation on the ground.
All right, final question to you, Nick. You mentioned the difficulty of trying to tackle root issues like Russia's concerns over demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, which was the original reason for the full-scale invasion in 2022. Now, the root concern for Ukraine arguably would be getting some kind of security guarantee from the US so that Russia does not carry out an invasion again. Can the US balance demands from both sides if either side, even one set of demands, would be so difficult to meet?
Yeah, well, so I think it's an incredibly difficult balancing act for the United States at this delicate time when essentially it's trying not to antagonize either side by doing something or committing something that would lead the other side to walk away. And there's plenty going on here. The United States, within the course of this week, after its meeting with Ukraine in Saudi Arabia, said that it was restarting intelligence sharing with Kiev, and it is restarting military shipments to the country as well. On that second point, that is something that is worrying Russia, because it's asking, essentially, will the US continue to arm Ukraine if there were to be this proposed 30-day ceasefire period? Russia also has concerns about what would happen to the Kursk region of Russia, a part that Ukraine managed to capture, but Russia has largely taken back since then. Also, questions from Moscow about who would police this ceasefire period and beyond that. And the two sides are coming at it from slightly different viewpoints. Ukraine wants this as a two-part process, that 30-day ceasefire, while negotiations for a longer-term peace take place in the background. President Putin, though, is saying that Russia would much prefer this to be one big deal, because it is worried, as we heard from Dasha just a moment ago, that during that 30-day ceasefire, Kiev might use it as an opportunity to rearm and get ready to continue the fight. So still plenty of things to be worked out, but at least at this stage, the signals from Ukraine, from Russia, from the US seems to be optimistic, seems to be moving in the right direction.
Oh, thanks. Nick Harper there from Washington, D.C., and Dasha Chernyshova for us in Moscow.